"You have nothing we need, old woman," my daughter-in-law said, it right in front of my son, my grandson, and her own parents. She was wrong about the old woman. She was wrong about the nothing. And she had no idea that the boy sitting next to me had already written down everything she'd done. That was what my daughter-in-law said to me. Not whispered, not implied, not dressed up in the polite language people use when they want to wound you without leaving a mark. She said it out loud, clearly, in the middle of a Friday night dinner, with her parents sitting right there across from me and my grandson Marcus, frozen in his chair at the far end of the table. She said it the way people say things when they have been waiting a long time to say them and have finally decided they no longer care what it costs. My name is Ruth Ann Whitfield. I am 64 years old. I was born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina, and I have lived in this city long enough to know the difference between a person who loses their temper and a person who has made a decision. What I heard in Diane's voice that Friday evening was not anger, it was relief. I had arrived at my son Calvin's house at 6:30, the same way I always did a few minutes early. A pan of cornbread wrapped in a kitchen towel tucked under my arm, wearing the gray dress Calvin once told me was his favorite. The house smelled like roasted chicken and something sweet, maybe a candle Diane had lit near the front window. Everything looked the way it always looked when Diane was expecting company. Careful, arranged, designed to impress. Diane's parents, Richard and Sylvia Cho, were already seated when I arrived. Richard stood briefly and gave me the kind of nod that men give when they are being polite but not warm. Sylvia smiled in that thin, practiced way of hers, the smile that never quite reached her eyes. I had met them 3 times before. Each time felt exactly like this, like I was a guest in a house that had already decided what it thought of me. Marcus was sitting at the far end of the table. He was 12, small for his age, with his father's dark eyes and a quietness about him that reminded me of someone I used to know very well. When he saw me come in, his face opened up the way a child's face does when they spot something safe in an unfamiliar room. He started to stand. Diane caught his shoulder without looking at him and pressed him back down into his seat. Calvin appeared from the kitchen a moment later. He gave me a hug that lasted about half a second longer than it should have, the kind of hug that carries an apology inside it. I didn't say anything about that. I set the cornbread on the counter and took my seat at the table. For the first 20 minutes, dinner was exactly what I expected. Richard talked about real estate. Sylvia asked about a neighborhood she had read about in some magazine. Diane served the chicken and made sure everyone's glass stayed full. Calvin said very little. He had a way of going quiet at these dinners, shrinking himself down to something small and untroublesome, and I had learned not to take it personally, or at least I had tried. It was somewhere between the first course and the second that the conversation turned. Richard said something about property values in the area. Sylvia agreed. Then Diane said something about the importance of planning ahead, of making sure assets were managed by the right people. She looked at me when she said it. Not a long look, just long enough. I reached for my glass of water. That was when it happened. Diane set her fork down on her plate. The sound was small but sharp, like a period at the end of a sentence no one had heard coming. She straightened in her chair. And then she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as settled, like someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally decided to put it down regardless of where it lands. "Women like you don't belong at this table," she said. The room went completely still. I did not gasp. I did not reach for words. I simply sat there for a moment and let the silence be what it was. Across from me, Richard looked down at his plate. Sylvia lifted her wine glass. Calvin, my son, my only child, the boy I had raised and fed and stayed up nights worrying over, stared at the tablecloth like it contained the answers to every question he had ever been too afraid to ask. Nobody said a word. I folded my napkin. I placed it beside my plate the way my mother taught me to do when a meal was finished. Then I pushed my chair back slowly, stood up, and walked to the front hallway where I had left my coat. I took my time putting it on. One button, then the next. I heard Diane say something behind me, lower now, to the table rather than at me. I didn't listen to it. Some things are not worth carrying out the door with you. I stepped outside into the cool Charleston evening. The air smelled like salt water and cut grass. The street was quiet. A neighbor's porch light was on down the block, and somewhere in the distance a dog was barking at something only it could see. I had just reached the bottom of the porch steps when I heard small, quick footsteps behind me. "Grandma." I turned. Marcus came running down the front path, his jacket half-zipped, his sneakers barely tied. He didn't slow down until he reached me, and then he wrapped both arms around my waist and held on the way children hold on when they are trying to give comfort and receive it at the same time. I held him back. After a moment, he pulled away just enough to look up at me. His eyes were serious in a way that did not belong on the face of a 12-year-old. He glanced back at the house once, quickly, then reached into his jacket pocket and pressed something into mine. Something small and soft-covered, like a notebook. He leaned close. "Don't let them take it, Grandma," he whispered. Before I could ask him what he meant, the front door opened. Diane's voice cut across the yard like a blade. "Marcus, inside. Now." He looked at me one more time. Then he turned and went back up the path without running, which somehow made it worse, like he had already learned how to move through that house without drawing attention to himself. I stood on the sidewalk and watched the door close behind him. He was 12 years old and already the bravest person in that house. I stood on that sidewalk for a long time. The street was quiet around me. The neighbor's porch light was still on. The dog had stopped barking. Inside Calvin's house, I could see the dining room light glowing through the curtains, and I could imagine, without much effort, exactly what was happening in there, the conversation resuming, the plates being cleared, Diane refilling her mother's wine glass as if nothing had shifted at all. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the edge of the notebook Marcus had pressed into my hand. I didn't open it. Not yet. I just held it there, my fingers resting on the cover, and I stood in the cool Charleston air and let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. But before I tell you what I found inside that notebook, I need to tell you something else first. Because to understand what happened that night, you need to understand who was sitting at that table. My mother taught me to sew when I was 7 years old, in the back room of her sister's house on the east side of Charleston. She had a Singer machine that was older than she was, and she treated it like furniture that breathed. She told me that a woman who could make something with her hands would never be entirely at anyone's mercy. I was 7. I didn't fully understand what she meant, but I remembered it. I opened my first sewing shop when I was 26 years old, using $3,000 I had saved over 4 years of working double shifts at a laundry on Meeting Street. It was a narrow little place on the corner of King and Cannon, barely wide enough for 2 sewing tables and a rack of fabric bolts, but it was mine. I named it Whitfield Alterations the day after Thomas Whitfield asked me to marry him in the parking lot of a Piggly Wiggly on a Tuesday afternoon, which was possibly the least romantic proposal in the history of South Carolina, and also the best thing that ever happened to me. Thomas was a quiet man. Not shy, there is a difference. He was the kind of quiet that comes from paying close attention to everything around you, the kind that makes people feel heard without him having said much at all. He worked at a freight company on the edge of the harbor, loading and unloading cargo 6 days a week. He had rough hands and a precise mind and a habit of writing things down in small notebooks that he kept in his shirt pocket. When I think about Marcus now, sitting at that dinner table with that serious look on his face, I see Thomas. I have always seen Thomas in that boy. We built things slowly, Thomas and I. That was always our way. The sewing shop grew into a small alterations and custom clothing business. We hired 2 women, then 4. We moved into a larger space on Rutledge Avenue. Thomas kept his job at the freight company for 6 more years, and in that time, he watched that industry the way he watched everything carefully, patiently, taking notes. By the time Calvin was in elementary school, Thomas had learned enough to start something of his own. Whitfield & Sons was not a grand name for a grand company. It was the name Thomas wrote on a piece of notebook paper one evening at our kitchen table, with Calvin sitting across from him doing homework, and it was the name that ended up on the side of 3 delivery trucks, then 7, then 12. Thomas built the logistics company the same way we had built everything else carefully, without showing off, putting more back in than he took out. Calvin grew up in the middle of all of it. He used to ride along on deliveries with Thomas on Saturday mornings when he was small, sitting up front with his feet barely reaching the floor of the cab, asking questions about every street they turned down. He was a good boy, patient, like his father, grateful in that easy, natural way that some children have before the world teaches them to measure things. Thomas was diagnosed 7 years ago. In the spring, pancreatic cancer, stage 3. He had known something was wrong for months before he told me, which was the most Thomas thing he could possibly have done. By the time I knew, the doctors were already talking in the measured, careful language that means they are trying to prepare you for something they cannot change. We had 8 months. During those 8 months, Thomas did what Thomas always did. He paid attention. He made notes. He sat with George Whitfield, our family attorney, no relation, a man Thomas had trusted for 20 years, and he made arrangements. He restructured things. He prepared for a future he would not be in, which I believe was the most deliberate act of love I have ever witnessed in my life. On a Tuesday evening in October, 3 weeks before he died, Thomas called me into the living room. He was sitting in his chair by the window, the one that faced the garden, with a white envelope on the table beside him. My name was written on the front in his handwriting, that careful, even handwriting he had from all those years of keeping records. He looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. Then he said, "Ruth, everything I built has your name on it. Use it when the time comes." I sat down on the arm of the chair beside him and took his hand and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would have been adequate. We sat like that until the garden went dark outside the window. He died on a Thursday morning in November, quietly, the way he had lived. I put the envelope in the safe in our bedroom that same afternoon. I told myself I would open it when I was ready. Weeks passed, then months, then a year, then 6 more after that. The truth is, I was not sure I ever wanted to open it, because opening it meant accepting, in some final and irrevocable way, that the future he had prepared for was the one I was now living in. I don't know how long I stood on that sidewalk outside Calvin's house before I finally started walking toward my car. Long enough for the dining room light to go off. Long enough for the neighborhood to go fully quiet. The notebook was still in my pocket. The envelope was still in the safe at home, the same place it had been for 7 years. I kept that envelope for 7 years. The night Diane told me I didn't belong, I finally understood when the time had come. The drive home from Calvin's house took 22 minutes. I know because I counted the stoplights. 7 of them. I do that sometimes when my mind is moving faster than I want it to fix on something small and countable, something that keeps my hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road. The notebook was still in my coat pocket. I had not opened it. I told myself I would wait until I was home, until I was sitting at my own kitchen table under my own light. But in the meantime, my mind went somewhere else entirely. It went back 5 years. Calvin called me on a Wednesday afternoon in March, 5 years ago, and asked if he could bring someone over for Sunday dinner. What was unusual was the pause that came after the question, that particular kind of pause that tells you whatever comes next has been rehearsed. "It's a boy, Mom," he said finally. "His name is Marcus. He's 7 years old and he's mine." I sat down at the kitchen table. Calvin explained it carefully. He had known about Marcus for 2 years. The boy's mother, a woman named Patrice, had passed away from a sudden illness 8 months earlier. There was no other family. Calvin had spent those 2 years getting the legal situation sorted. Now Marcus was living with him and Diane on Beaufort Street. I asked how Diane was handling it. A long pause. "She's adjusting," he said. I didn't push. I simply told him Sunday dinner sounded fine and that I would make enough food for everyone. Marcus arrived that first Sunday holding Calvin's hand, wearing a collared shirt slightly too big for him. He had dark eyes that moved around a room the way careful people's eyes do, not anxious, just thorough, the way you look at a place when you are trying to understand it before you commit to being comfortable in it. He shook my hand when Calvin introduced us. 7 years old, and he shook my hand. I thought about Thomas immediately. Thomas used to say you could tell everything you needed to know about a person by the way they entered an unfamiliar room. Marcus entered mine like he was filing information away. Diane had come too, though she spent most of that first dinner near the kitchen window, stepping outside twice to take calls. She was pleasant enough when she spoke. She called Marcus the boy twice without seeming to notice she had done it. Calvin didn't correct her. I noticed, and I said nothing, because it was the first Sunday, and I told myself it was too early to draw conclusions. But I kept watching. Over the months that followed, I had Marcus at my house as often as Calvin would allow. He was a quiet child, not sad, just observant. He remembered everything. Tell him something once and he had it. He started asking me questions about the sewing shop, about the trucks, about Thomas. He loved the photograph of Thomas and Calvin on the delivery truck that I kept on the hallway shelf. He would stop in front of it every time he came over, just for a moment, like he was checking in on something. One afternoon, when he was about 8, he asked me why Thomas always had a notebook in his shirt pocket in the old photographs. I told him Thomas believed the most important things were always worth writing down. Marcus thought about that seriously. Then he nodded and went back to the puzzle he'd been working on at the kitchen table. 2 weeks later, Calvin dropped him off for a Saturday visit, and Marcus came in carrying a small notebook in his shirt pocket. I did not say anything about it, but I felt something shift in my chest that I have never quite found the right words for. Diane's feelings about Marcus were never something she tried hard to hide, at least not around me. She was never openly cruel, not then, but there was a quality to her indifference that was worse than cruelty in its own way. She forgot his schedule. She forgot what he liked to eat. She referred to his things as though they were inconveniences that had appeared in her house without permission. I watched Calvin navigate it the way he navigated most difficult things, by not naming it, by smoothing it over, by telling himself that fine was good enough. I did not think fine was good enough. But Marcus was not my child to raise, and I had to remind myself of that more times than I would like to admit. The moment I keep coming back to happened about 2 years ago. I had stopped by Calvin's house to drop off a birthday gift for Marcus. I rang the bell and no one answered, but Calvin's car was in the driveway, so I let myself in. I set the gift on the hallway table and was about to call out when I heard Diane's voice from the kitchen, low and precise, the way she spoke when she was not performing politeness for anyone. "That boy is not your problem anymore," she said, once we handled the money situation. Calvin said something I couldn't make out. Diane's response was immediate. "I'm serious, Calvin. One thing at a time." The kitchen went quiet. I stood in the hallway and did not move. Then I heard a small sound from the staircase. I turned. Marcus was sitting on the 3rd step from the bottom, perfectly still, watching me with those careful dark eyes. He had heard every word. I walked to the foot of the stairs and looked up at him. I didn't ask how long he had been sitting there. I didn't tell him not to worry. I just looked at him, and he looked at me, and something passed between us that did not need to be said out loud. I picked up the birthday gift from the hallway table and carried it up the stairs to him. Marcus heard every word. So did I. I got home a little past 9. The house was the way I had left it that afternoon, kitchen light on, radio off, the small lamp in the hallway casting its usual pale circle on the floor. I hung my coat on the hook by the door, then stopped, reached into the pocket, took out the notebook. It was small, maybe 4 inches by 6, a black cover, slightly worn at the corners, with a thin elastic band holding it shut, the kind of notebook you could buy at any drugstore for less than $2. I stood in the hallway for a moment, just holding it, thinking about Marcus pressing it into my hand in the dark outside Calvin's house, thinking about the look on his face when he did it. Then I carried it to the kitchen table, sat down, and opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably a child's uneven letters, some pressed too hard into the page, others barely there. But it was organized in a way that surprised me. Each entry had a date written at the top, underlined. Below the date, a few sentences, sometimes just one. Marcus had not been keeping a diary. He had been keeping a record. The first entry I stopped at was dated 6 weeks earlier, on a Thursday evening. Diane called someone she called Mr. Fielding. I was doing homework at the kitchen table. She went into the bedroom but didn't close the door all the way. She said, "What does it take to file for elderly competency?" She said, "How long does it usually take?" She said, "What if the person seems fine but you know they aren't?" I read it twice. Then I turned the page. The second entry that mattered was from about a month earlier, a Saturday afternoon. Diane was on the phone in the backyard. I watched from the upstairs window. She had papers in her hand. She kept saying Whitfield and Sons like she was reading it off something. She asked, "Is the LLC structure public record?" She asked, "Who has authority to make decisions for the company if the owner is declared unfit?" She wrote something down after that. I couldn't see what. I set the notebook down on the table. Whitfield and Sons, Thomas's company, our company. I did not fully understand yet what Diane was looking for or what she thought she would find, but I understood enough to know that she had been researching it deliberately, carefully, for weeks. The kind of research you do when you are building towards something. I picked the notebook back up. The third entry was the one that changed the temperature of the room. It was from 11 days ago, a Sunday night. Marcus had written it in slightly smaller letters than usual, like he was trying to make it take up less space on the page. Mom and Dad were arguing after dinner. I was supposed to be asleep. Mom said, "We need her to sign before the end of the quarter." Dad said he wasn't sure. Mom said, "Calvin, I need you to listen to me right now." She said, "Once she signs, we move Marcus out within the week." She said it like it was already decided, like she had already figured out where. I put the notebook down again. My hands were not steady. I looked at the page for a long time without reading it again. I didn't need to. Those words had already arranged themselves somewhere permanent in my memory. The way certain things do, the way you remember the exact tone of a voice delivering news you were not prepared for, the way a particular sentence stays with you not because you chose to keep it, but because it simply will not leave. Once she signs, we move Marcus out within the week. I thought about Marcus sitting on the third step of the staircase with those careful eyes listening. I thought about him choosing a notebook, carrying it in his shirt pocket the way Thomas used to, writing things down because someone had once told him the most important things were worth keeping. I thought about him running after me in the dark, half his jacket unzipped, pressing this into my hand. He had not panicked. He had not cried. He had done the only thing a 12-year-old boy could do when the adults around him were making plans he did not have the power to stop. He had documented everything, quietly, patiently, without anyone noticing. He was so much like Thomas it made my chest ache. I closed the notebook carefully and set it on the table in front of me. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the window before disappearing. I thought about the white envelope sitting in the safe in my bedroom, the one Thomas had left me, the one I had not opened in 7 years. I thought about what Thomas had said that October evening by the window. Use it when the time comes. I sat at that table for a long time after that, long enough for the kitchen to cool and the neighborhood to go completely still, long enough to understand that whatever was happening in that house on Beaufort Street had been in motion for months, and that Marcus had been the only person watching carefully enough to see it. My grandson had been living inside a house full of secrets, and he had written every single one of them down. I don't know how long I sat at that kitchen table after I closed the notebook. Long enough for the lamp in the hallway to feel too bright. Long enough for the house to settle into that particular silence it only reaches in the small hours, when even the street outside has given up making noise. At some point, I got up, filled a glass of water, and stood at the sink, drinking it slowly, looking out the window at the backyard where nothing was moving. Then I walked to the bedroom. The safe was in the closet, on the shelf above where Thomas used to keep his work boots. It was a small, fireproof box, the kind that looks almost ordinary until you know what's inside it. I had opened it twice in the past 7 years, once for the deed to the house, once for an insurance document I needed after a pipe burst in the kitchen. Both times I had moved quickly, found what I came for, and closed it again without looking at the white envelope sitting in the back left corner. Tonight was different. I took the envelope out and carried it to the edge of the bed and sat down. My name was on the front. Ruth. Just that. Nothing else. In Thomas's handwriting that careful. Even script he'd had since before I knew him. The same handwriting from 30 years of small notebooks kept in his shirt pocket. I turned the envelope over in my hands once. The seal was still intact. I had never broken it. I broke it now. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten on the same cream-colored legal paper Thomas used for everything that mattered. The date at the top was a Tuesday in October, 3 weeks before he died. I recognized the date immediately. It was the same evening he had called me into the living room, the same evening he had looked at me from his chair by the garden window and said what he said. His handwriting was slightly different from what I remembered, slower, more deliberate, like each word had been chosen and set down with the care of someone who understood they were not going to get a second draft. He began the way Thomas always began difficult things, without preamble. Ruth, by the time you open this, you'll have decided the time is right. I trust that completely. I always have. He wrote about the company. Not in numbers, he had saved the numbers for George, he said, and George would walk me through everything when I was ready. But he explained the shape of it, the way he had structured things in the final year of his illness, the decisions he had made and why he had made them. He had built protections into the company's foundation, the way you build them into a house not visible from the outside, not obvious unless you knew where to look, but solid, designed to last. He had thought of everything. That was the thing that kept stopping me as I read. He had thought of things I would not have thought to think of, contingencies I would not have known to plan for. He wrote about it without pride, the way he wrote about everything matter-of-factly, like he was simply explaining how something worked, like the fact that he had spent the last months of his life quietly building walls around everything we had made together was just what you did when you loved someone and ran out of time. "Call George when you're ready," he wrote. "He has the full picture. He's been waiting for your call since the day I asked him to wait." He wrote about Calvin. He wrote about what he had hoped for him and what he had come to accept, and the particular sorrow of loving a child who was still in the process of becoming who he was going to be. He was not unkind about it. Thomas was never unkind, but he was honest, which was sometimes harder. And then, on the 4th page, his handwriting changed slightly, more careful, like he was writing something he had thought about for a long time. "There is a boy. I don't know his name yet, or whether he exists, or what shape he'll arrive in, but I know Calvin, and I know that love finds ways of making itself known even when we try to keep it quiet. If there is a child, if there is ever a child that comes to you asking to be claimed, claim him, Ruth, without hesitation. That child will need you more than you know." I had to stop reading for a moment because Marcus had arrived 4 years after Thomas died, and Thomas had written this as though he had somehow known. I sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet of that room, and I let myself feel the full weight of it, the strangeness of being known so completely by someone who was no longer there to know you, the particular grief of receiving something this generous from someone you could not thank. Then I turned to the last paragraph. It was short. 4 sentences. The handwriting was the slowest of all, like he had saved whatever was left of his strength for this part. "Tell him I knew. Tell him he was always mine. And Ruth, you'll know exactly what to do. You always did." I folded the letter carefully along its original creases and held it in both hands and did not move for a long time. The bedroom was dark except for the hallway light coming through the gap under the door. Outside, nothing. Just the deep quiet of a city finally asleep. Thomas had been gone for 7 years, but sitting in the dark with that letter in my hands, it felt like he had never left. I did not sleep. I lay on top of the covers with Thomas's letter on the nightstand beside me and watched the ceiling go from black to gray to the pale yellow that meant morning had arrived whether I was ready for it or not. At some point, the birds started up outside. A car backed out of a driveway down the street. The neighborhood resumed itself, ordinary and unhurried, the way neighborhoods do regardless of what has happened inside any particular house. By 6:15 I was dressed. By 6:30 I was in the kitchen with coffee I barely tasted, Thomas's letter folded back into its envelope on the table in front of me, Marcus's notebook beside it. I had read both of them twice more during the night, not because I needed to, because I needed to be certain I had understood correctly. I had understood correctly. Thomas's letter had been clear. "Call George. He has the full picture. He's been waiting for your call since the day I asked him to wait." So at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning, I called George Whitfield. He answered on the second ring. I had known George Whitfield for 25 years. He was the kind of lawyer Thomas had trusted completely, which was not a thing Thomas did easily or quickly. George was in his late 60s now, with the unhurried manner of a man who had spent decades listening carefully before speaking, and a memory for detail that had always reminded me of Thomas himself. When I told him I had finally opened the envelope, there was a pause on the other end of the line, not surprise exactly, more like the quiet acknowledgement of something long expected. "I've been waiting for that call for 7 years, he said. "Can you come in this morning?" I told him I could come in right now. His office was on the 4th floor of a building on Broad Street, 12 minutes from my house. I had been there before, years ago, for the paperwork surrounding Thomas's estate. The waiting room had the same dark wood furniture, the same framed print of the Charleston Harbor on the wall, the same faint smell of old paper and leather that I associated with serious things being handled carefully. A young woman at the front desk offered me coffee. I thanked her and said no. George came out himself to bring me in. He sat across from me at his desk with a folder that looked like it had been used many times, the edges worn soft. Thomas's name written on the tab in George's own handwriting. He opened it without ceremony and began explaining what Thomas had built. The structure of it was more considered than I had understood from the letter alone. Whitfield & Sons was held inside a limited liability company, with Ruth Ann Whitfield listed as the sole managing member. The logistics contracts, the property the company operated from, the equipment, all of it sitting inside that structure, protected in ways that required Ruth Ann Whitfield's written authorization to move, access, or transfer. Thomas had designed it that way deliberately, George explained, not because he had anticipated any specific threat, because he had known, with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years watching how the world worked, that the thing most likely to threaten what he had built was not a market or a competitor, but a person. Then George told me what the company was worth: $5.2 million. He said it plainly, the way you say a fact. I heard it the same way, not with shock, exactly, but with a particular kind of stillness, the kind that comes when something you have known in the abstract suddenly becomes completely concrete. Thomas had never spoken in those terms. He had spoken about the work, the contracts, the people, the trucks, not the number. And I had not pushed for the number because Thomas's relationship with money had always been the same as his relationship with everything else. It was a tool, not a destination, and you used it for what it was meant for, and you did not make more of it than that. $5.2 million. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked George what came next. He folded his hands on the desk and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before, not concern exactly, something more careful than that. "There's something else," he said. "Something I should have called you about sooner, but I wasn't certain enough until recently." He opened a second, thinner folder. 8 months ago, he told me, a document had been filed with his office, a limited power of attorney, granting a named individual access to certain financial information connected to Whitfield & Sons. Routine paperwork on its face. The kind of thing that would move through without much attention if everything looked correct. Everything had looked almost correct. Almost. George slid the document across the desk toward me. The signature at the bottom was mine. My name, in my handwriting or something close enough to my handwriting that it had given him pause rather than stopping him outright. George had not filed it forward. He had held it. He had compared it to the signature on file from my original company documents. He had looked at it again 2 weeks later, and again a month after that, and each time something about it had continued to bother him in the way that things bother careful people, not loudly, not conclusively, just persistently, like a sound in a wall you can't quite locate. He had been waiting, he said, for either his concern to resolve itself or for me to call. He tapped the bottom of the page gently. "Ruth," he said, "this is your signature, but I don't think you wrote it." I looked at the page for a long time without speaking. My signature. My name. My handwriting. Almost exactly the way you might reproduce something after studying it carefully enough, the way you might copy the shape of letters without quite capturing the particular weight and rhythm of the hand that originally made them. I thought about Diane sitting in my kitchen 8 months ago, a stack of papers on the table between us, saying it was insurance paperwork Calvin had asked her to drop off. I thought about stepping into the kitchen to make tea, leaving those papers on the table for 20 minutes, maybe 30. I had not signed anything. I was certain of that. But I had left my handwriting on enough other documents in that stack for someone patient enough to study them. Someone had been using my name, and they had been doing it for 8 months. The weekend passed quietly. Too quietly, maybe. Saturday afternoon, I sat in the living room with a book I did not read. Sunday morning, I went to church, which I do most Sundays, and I sat in the third pew from the front, the way I always do, and I let the service move around me without quite landing on me. Afterward, a woman named Carolyn, who has sat 2 rows behind me for 15 years, asked if I was feeling all right. I told her I was fine. She looked at me the way people look when they know fine is not the whole answer, but understand this is not the moment to push. I drove home. I made lunch. I did not open Marcus's notebook again. I did not need to. The 3 entries were already arranged in my memory in the order Marcus had recorded them, and they sat there, patient and specific, waiting for Monday morning the way evidence waits quietly, without going anywhere. George had made the appointment for 9 o'clock. The document examiner's name was Patricia Odom. She worked out of a small office on King Street, 2 floors above a framing shop, in a building that smelled like old wood and something chemical I couldn't quite identify. She was a compact woman in her late 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades being careful about what she said and exactly how she said it. George had sent her the document on Saturday. She had already done her preliminary review by the time we arrived. She laid out 3 pages on the light table along the far wall, the document in question, a copy of Ruth's original signature from the company's founding papers, and a 3rd document George had pulled from his files that also carried Ruth's authenticated signature from several years earlier. She walked us through them without theater, pointing to specific characteristics the way a person describes directions matter-of-factly, as if the information existed independently of any emotion anyone might have about it. The pressure distribution was wrong. Ruth's genuine signature, Patricia explained, showed a consistent heaviness on the downstrokes, a habit formed over decades that showed up in both older samples in identical ways. The signature on the file document was close. It had the right general shape and the right approximate proportions. But the pressure was even throughout, the way it is when someone is concentrating on reproducing a shape rather than simply making it. The letter spacing was slightly wider than Ruth's norm. The terminal stroke on the final letter of her last name lifted at a different angle. Patricia looked up from the light table. "This signature was copied," she said. "It's a good copy, but it's a copy." George wrote something in the folder he had brought. Ruth stood very still and looked at the 3 pages side by side and felt something settle in her chest. Not satisfaction, nothing close to that, but the particular clarity that comes when something you suspected becomes something you know. On the drive back to George's office, Ruth looked out the passenger window at King Street moving past and let her memory go back 8 months. It had been a Tuesday. She was certain of that because she always did her bookkeeping on Tuesdays, and she had been at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on and a cup of tea going cold beside her laptop when the doorbell rang. Diane. She had been dressed well, the way she always was, cream blouse, hair done, the kind of effort that signals this is not a casual visit. She had a large envelope under her arm and an explanation ready before Ruth had fully opened the door. Calvin had asked her to drop off some insurance paperwork, she said. It needed to go to George's office by the end of the week. She couldn't stay. Ruth had taken the envelope. She had offered tea anyway, because that was what you did, and Diane had surprised her by accepting. They had sat in the living room for a few minutes, making the careful small talk that had always defined their relationship polite, surface, neither of them saying anything that mattered. Then Diane had remembered something she needed to do and excused herself, and Ruth had walked her to the door. The envelope had stayed on the kitchen table. Ruth had gone back to her bookkeeping. The tea had gone colder. At some point, she had moved the envelope to the side to make room for her laptop, and then she had forgotten about it entirely until the following morning, when she had put it with the other papers she meant to take to George's office. She had never opened it. She had never signed anything inside it. She had simply let it sit on her kitchen table for 30 minutes while she and Diane drank tea in the next room. 30 minutes. She thought about Diane excusing herself to use the bathroom. She thought about the kitchen table being visible from the hallway. She thought about the other papers already spread across that table, the bookkeeping documents, the company correspondence, things with Ruth's signature already on them, already made. She hadn't needed Ruth to sign anything. She had needed Ruth's kitchen table and 30 uninterrupted minutes. She didn't need me to sign. She just needed my signature. Back at George's office, Ruth told him everything she had just remembered. The Tuesday visit, the envelope, the tea, the 30 minutes. George listened without interrupting, the way he always listened, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "That's consistent with what Patricia found," he said. "Someone with access to documents carrying your authentic signature, enough time to study them, and the skill to reproduce the result." He picked up his phone from the desk. "What are you doing?" Ruth asked. "Calling the right people," he said simply. He dialed. Ruth sat in the chair across from his desk and listened to him speak in the measured, precise way he spoke when something serious needed to be handled correctly, and he was making sure it would be. Diane hadn't made a mistake. She had made a crime, and George was already calling the right people. George called on Tuesday morning at 8:45. I was in the backyard when the phone rang. pulling dead stems off the rose bushes Thomas had planted along the back fence the spring before he got sick. It was something I did when I needed to keep my hands busy and my mind from moving too fast in any one direction. The morning was cool and gray, the kind of October sky that can't quite decide whether it intends to rain. "There's something I need to show you," George said. "Can you come in this afternoon?" His voice had the particular quality it carried when something was serious, not alarmed, just precise, careful in a way that went slightly beyond his usual careful. I told him I could be there by 1 o'clock. I pulled 2 more dead stems off the rosebush and then set down my gloves and went inside to get ready. George had a second folder on his desk when I arrived, thicker than the one from Saturday, with several tabbed sections and what looked like printed contract pages clipped along one side. He had a yellow legal pad beside it with handwritten notes in 2 columns, the kind of layout he used when he was organizing information he intended to present in a specific order. He waited until I had settled into the chair across from him before he began. After our conversation on Saturday, he said, "I went back through the full Whitfield & Sons file, everything Thomas left with me. I wanted to understand the complete picture before we moved any further." I nodded. "There's a contract I need to walk you through." He turned to the first tab section and slid it across the desk. The contract was with a company called Hartwell Industries. George explained the relationship as he had found it in Thomas's files. Hartwell was a regional manufacturing and distribution firm, mid-sized, based out of Columbia, but with operations that ran across 4 states. About 6 years ago, Thomas had negotiated an exclusive logistics partnership with them. Whitfield & Sons handled their regional freight warehousing coordination, last-mile delivery, time-sensitive cargo across the Southeast. In return, Hartwell paid a flat annual rate, renewable each year by mutual agreement. The annual rate was $3,800,000. George let that number settle before he continued. The contract had renewed automatically for 5 consecutive years under Thomas's management, and then once more after Thomas passed, when George had handled the renewal paperwork on Ruth's behalf using the standing authorization Thomas had established. But that authorization had a limit. It covered administrative renewals for a defined period. That period ended with the current contract cycle. The current contract expired in 87 days. When it did, the renewal would require a new signature, not an administrative continuation, a full, direct authorization from Ruth Ann Whitfield as managing member of the LLC. Only Ruth could sign it. George set down his pen. "If the contract isn't renewed," he said, "Whitfield & Sons loses its primary revenue source. The company could sustain itself for a period on reserves, but the financial structure Thomas built was designed around that contract as its foundation. Without it, the picture changes significantly." I looked at the contract pages in front of me. The dates, the rates, the terms. 87 days. I asked the question I already suspected the answer to. Who at Hartwell would be affected if this contract fell through on their side? George picked up his legal pad. "That," he said, "is the other thing I found." He had made some calls that morning. "Careful ones," he said, "the kind of inquiries that stay within the lines of what's appropriate but cover the necessary ground." What he had found was this. Hartwell Industries was currently involved in a significant commercial litigation matter. A dispute with a former regional partner over freight contract exclusivity, the kind of case that turned on the question of whether Hartwell's existing logistics arrangements were ironclad or could be challenged. The lead attorney representing Hartwell in that litigation was a woman named Diane Whitfield. I sat very still. George continued in the same measured tone. Diane had taken the Hartwell case 14 months ago. It was, by Ed Gotti, any assessment, the most significant case of her career, the kind of case that established reputations, that moved lawyers from good firms into exceptional ones. The opposing counsel was experienced and well-resourced. The case hinged, in significant part, on demonstrating that Hartwell's logistics infrastructure was stable, contracted, and not subject to disruption. If Whitfield & Sons failed to renew its contract with Hartwell, that stability disappeared. The opposing counsel would use the gap. Diane's argument collapsed. The case, the career-defining, reputation-making case that Diane had spent 14 months building, went with it. And Diane knew it. George folded his hands on the desk. "She's known about the renewal deadline for some time," he said. long enough to have understood what it meant and what she would need to secure it. I looked at the contract pages again. The 87 days, the $3,800,000 per year, the LLC structure that put the renewal signature entirely in my hands. I thought about Marcus's notebook, the entry about Diane asking someone about the LLC structure on a Saturday afternoon, papers in her hand, saying Whitfield and Sons like she was reading it off something. The entry about the elderly competency filing. I thought about the forged signature, 8 months of preparation. I thought about the dinner, the way Diane had looked at me when I walked in, not with dislike, exactly, with calculation. She had not come after my money because she was greedy, though maybe she was that too. She had come after it because she was desperate, because something she had built her future on was about to come apart, and the one thing standing between her and that disaster was a signature from a woman she had spent years treating like she was nobody. She didn't just want my money. She wanted the one thing my signature could give her, her career. The room was quiet for a moment. Then George said, carefully, "What would you like to do, Ruth?" I looked at the contract. I looked at the 87 days. I thought about Thomas sitting at his kitchen table with a notebook in his shirt pocket, building something that would outlast him, putting my name on all of it, trusting that I would know what to do when the time came. I looked up at George. "Not yet," I said. "I want to understand the full picture first. All of it." George nodded slowly, like that was exactly the answer he had expected. Diane Whitfield had spent 8 months engineering the perfect trap. What she didn't know was that the trap had always belonged to me. I called Sandra from the parking garage on Broad Street before I had even started the car. She answered on the 3rd ring, the way she usually did, not rushed, not slow, just present, like she had been expecting the call and had simply been waiting for it to come at its own time. "I need you to come over," I said. A brief pause. "How soon?" "As soon as you can." Another pause, shorter this time. "I'll stop at Glazed on the way." That was Sandra. 31 years of friendship had taught her that certain conversations required something on the table between you, and that donuts from the shop on King Street were as good a thing as any. Sandra Cho had been my closest friend since the year Calvin started kindergarten, when we had both ended up on the same school volunteer committee, and discovered, over the course of one very long afternoon, sorting through a box of broken crayons, that we had the same opinion about most things that mattered and the same willingness to say so. She was 62, sharp-eyed, with the kind of directness that some people found abrasive, and I had always found like fresh air. She had worked beside me at Whitfield Alterations for 11 years before she retired, and she knew my life the way people know a place they have spent a long time in, not just the rooms, but the walls behind the rooms. She arrived 40 minutes later with a box of donuts and 2 coffees from the place on King Street, exactly as promised. She set them on the kitchen table, took off her coat, sat down, and looked at me. "Start from the beginning," she said. So I did. I told her everything. Not in the careful, sequenced way I had told George, but the way you tell things to someone who already knows most of the context and just needs the new parts filled in. I told her about Friday night, about Diane's words at the dinner table and Calvin's silence and Marcus running after me in the dark. I told her about the notebook and the 3 entries. I told her about Thomas's letter, about George's office, about Patricia Odom on King Street with the light table and the 3 pages laid out side by side. I told her about Hartwell Industries, about the 87 days, about Diane standing in my kitchen 8 months ago with an envelope under her arm and an explanation ready. Sandra listened to all of it without interrupting, which for Sandra was a significant act of restraint. She held her coffee with both hands and watched my face and did not say a word until I had finished. Then she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to tell you something." "About 3 months ago," she said, she had stopped into a coffee shop on East Bay Street on a Wednesday morning. "The little one with the green awning," she said, "that's been there since before either of us could remember." She had gone in for a cup to take on a walk, nothing more, and she had almost not noticed them at all. But Sandra noticed things. It was one of her qualities. Diane was sitting at a corner table near the back window. Sandra recognized her immediately, the posture, the way Diane always dressed like she was about to walk into a courtroom even when she wasn't. Across from her was a man Sandra did not recognize. He was somewhere in his late 50s, she thought, heavy-set, in a dark blazer. He had a laptop open on the table and several folders spread out beside it. They were not having a casual conversation. They were working through something, pointing at the screen, turning pages. Sandra had not approached them. She had gotten her coffee and left. At the time, she said, she had thought nothing of it. Diane was a lawyer. Lawyers met with people. It was not unusual, but something about it stayed with me, Sandra said. The way she was leaning over those papers. I've seen you look at documents that way. It's not how you look at something ordinary. She set her coffee down. I didn't say anything because I didn't know what I was seeing. But after everything you just told me, she paused. Ruth, she's been planning this longer than you think. I looked at my own coffee, which had gone mostly cold while I was talking. I know, I said. So have I. Sandra studied me for a moment with those sharp eyes of hers. What does that mean, exactly? It means, I said carefully, that I'm not going to do anything until I understand exactly how far she's gone and exactly what she believes she has. And Calvin? I thought about Calvin. About the phone call I knew was probably coming, about the careful, uncomfortable conversation that would follow, about the particular difficulty of telling your child something true about the person they chose to build their life with. Not yet, I said. Not until we know more. Sandra nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. Then she asked the question I had been asking myself since I sat down in George's office that afternoon. How much time do you have? 87 days, I said, give or take. Sandra looked at me steadily. That's enough. It has to be, I said. We sat together at my kitchen table for another hour after that, not talking about Diane or contracts or forged signatures, just talking the way old friends talk when they have gotten through the difficult part and need to remember that the rest of life is still there on the other side of it. Sandra told me something funny that had happened at her sister's house the week before. I refilled our coffees. The afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor the way it did in October, low and golden, reminding you that the days were getting shorter whether you were ready for them to or not. When Sandra finally stood to leave, she paused at the kitchen door and looked back at me. You know what Thomas would say, she said. I did know. I had been thinking about it all afternoon. You'll know exactly what to do. You always did. I walked Sandra to the door and watched her go down the front path to her car. Then I stood in the doorway for a moment, feeling the cool evening air, thinking about 87 days and what they needed to contain. The truth has a way of finding its own path. Our job was simply to make sure it arrived before the contract deadline did. 2 days after Sandra left, my phone rang. I hadn't reached out to Calvin. Diane had reached out for me. Those 2 days had been quiet in the particular way that quiet gets when you are waiting for something you cannot predict but feel coming. I had gone about my routines, morning coffee, a walk down to the market on Wednesday, an hour in the afternoon tending to the last of the fall garden before the cold made it pointless. I had spoken with George once, briefly, to confirm that the appropriate contacts had been notified about the forged document and that things were moving in the way they needed to move. He told me to be patient. I told him patience was something I had been practicing for a long time. Thursday morning, I was in the sewing room when the phone rang. I still kept Thomas's old sewing room in the back of the house, though I used it more for mending now than for anything else. It was a small room with good light and a window that faced the side yard where the camellia bushes grew, and it was the room I went to when I needed to think without quite admitting to myself that I was thinking. I had a pair of Calvin's old curtains in my lap that I had been meaning to repair for 2 years. I had not made much progress on them. I looked at the screen before I answered. Calvin. I let it ring once more. Then I picked up. Hey, Mom. His voice was careful in a way that Calvin's voice was not usually careful. Calvin was not a guarded person by nature. He had his father's directness and his own particular warmth, and when he called on ordinary days, there was an ease to how he spoke that I had always been grateful for. This was not that. Hi, sweetheart, I said. How are you doing? Everything okay? The question was ordinary. The tone underneath it was not. I'm fine, I said. Just doing some mending. How are you? Good, yeah. A pause. I've been thinking about you since Friday. I waited. Diane mentioned something, he said. The words came out measured, like he had rehearsed the approach but was less certain about what came after it. She said she's been a little worried. About you. About another pause. About whether you're managing everything all right? On your own? I kept my voice even. What kind of everything? Just finances, the company stuff. She said she's heard some things that made her think maybe it's getting to be a lot for one person to handle. I looked out the window at the camellia bushes. The leaves were very still. What kind of things did she hear? I asked. Calvin hesitated. I don't know the specifics. She just said she was concerned, that maybe having some family oversight would take some pressure off you. Family oversight. The same phrase Marcus had recorded in his notebook, in Diane's voice, on a Thursday evening 6 weeks ago. Calvin, I said, keeping my voice the same way you keep a door the same, steady, not pushed, not pulled. Is everything okay with the company? A silence opened on the other end of the line. I counted it the way I had learned to count silences, not impatiently, but carefully, the way you measure something you want to understand accurately. 1 second, 2, 3, 4. The refrigerator in the kitchen cycled on. Somewhere outside, a car slowed at the stop sign on the corner. 5, 6, 7. The camellia leaves moved once in a small wind and then went still again. 8, 9. Yeah, Calvin said. Of course it is. Diane thought it would be good for someone to, have their eyes on things, just in case. In case of what? Another pause, shorter this time. In case you ever need help. I thought about the folder on George's desk, the contract and its 87 days, the light table on King Street with 3 signatures laid out side by side, the notebook in the drawer of my nightstand with its careful, dated entries in a 12-year-old's handwriting. I appreciate you checking in, I said. Yeah, of course. He sounded relieved, which told me he had been dreading the call. She cares, Mom. That's all it is. I know, I said. Another brief silence. Then, quietly, in a tone that carried something in it, I could not quite name something between apology and explanation, between loyalty and doubt. Diane just wants to help. I know she does, I said. And then the call was over. I sat in the sewing room for a long time after that with the curtains still in my lap and the phone face down on the side table beside me. The room was very quiet. The light through the window had shifted the way it did in the late morning, going from the soft, pale quality of early October to something slightly sharper and more direct. The camellias were still. I thought about Calvin's voice. Not the words were Diane's. I was fairly certain of that. Arranged and handed to him the way you hand someone a script you want delivered, but the voice underneath them, the hesitation, the relief when I hadn't pushed back, the particular tone of a man who was saying what he had been asked to say and was not entirely sure he believed it. Calvin did not know about the forged signature. He did not know about Hartwell Industries or 87 Days or the folder in George's office. He had been given a version of this situation that Diane had constructed carefully, a version in which Ruth was aging and overwhelmed and in need of management, and he had carried it to me in good faith because he loved me and because the person he trusted most had told him it was true. He was not my enemy. He was just a man who had been told a very convincing story. The question was whether he would believe it when he heard mine. I sent the text Thursday evening, an hour after Calvin hung up. Nothing elaborate. Just, would you want to have lunch Saturday? Just the two of us. There's a place on Rutledge I've been meaning to try. I put the phone down after I sent it and went to make dinner and did not check it again for 40 minutes. When I did, his reply was there. Sure, Mom. Noon? Noon is fine, I wrote back. That was all. No explanation from either of us about why this felt necessary. No acknowledgement that the phone call 2 hours earlier had changed something between us, even slightly. Just a time and a place and the particular understanding that two people have when they both know a conversation is coming and have agreed, without saying so, to let it arrive on its own terms. The restaurant was a small place I had driven past many times, without stopping a lunch counter and 6 tables, a chalkboard menu on the wall, the kind of spot that had been there long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. I arrived first and took a table near the window. The server, a young woman with a Charleston accent thick enough to cut, brought me water and a menu without being asked. I ordered coffee and settled in. Calvin arrived at 2 minutes past noon. He looked tired. Not the ordinary tired of a long week, but the specific tired that settles into a person when they have been carrying something they were not built to carry. His shoulders were slightly forward. There were lines around his eyes that I did not remember being so defined. He was 41 years old, and he looked, in that moment, like a man in the middle of something he had not yet found his way through. He saw me and managed to smile. It was real enough. Calvin had never been a good performer. "Hey, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart." I stood briefly and we hugged, and then we sat down and looked at the menus for a moment in the way people do when they need something to do with their hands before the real conversation begins. We ordered. We talked about ordinary things at first, the weather turning, a neighbor of mine whose dog had gotten into my garden again, a project Calvin mentioned at work. He was making an effort and I appreciated it, and I let him make it for a little while, because there is value in the ordinary parts of a conversation, and because I was in no hurry. But at some point the ordinary parts ran out. I set my coffee down and looked at him directly. "Calvin," I said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly." He met my eyes, nodded once. "How long have you known about the plan to have me sign over financial authority?" A breath. He looked at the table, then back up. "A few months," he said. Diane brought it up. She said it was just a precaution. "Did you agree with her?" He was quiet for a moment. I thought. He stopped. Started again. "She made it sound reasonable, like it was something responsible people did. And you believed her." "She's my wife, Mom." I nodded. I did not say anything to that, because it was true and because it was not the point. "What about Marcus?" I asked. Something shifted in his expression. The slightest tightening. "What about him? Does Diane talk to you about him? About what happens to him in longer-term plans?" Calvin picked up his water glass and set it down again without drinking from it. "She thinks it might be better for him to have more structure, a different environment maybe." "What kind of different environment?" He did not answer. "Calvin, she mentioned a program," he said finally, and the words came out like they cost him something. "For kids who need more support. She said it would be good for him." I looked at my son for a long moment. He was staring at the table. I reached into my bag and took out Marcus's notebook and set it on the table between us. Calvin looked at it. Then he looked at me. "Marcus gave me this," I said, "the night of the dinner. He ran after me in the dark to make sure I had it." Calvin picked it up slowly. He opened it to the first page. I watched his face as he read the way it changed, incrementally, the way a landscape changes when clouds move across it. His jaw tightened. A muscle worked once near his temple. He turned to the second entry, then the third. He went back to the second, then the third again. The restaurant moved around us, plates clearing at the counter, voices at another table, the server asking someone near the door if they needed anything. Calvin read through all of it without making a sound. When he finished, he closed the notebook and set it carefully on the table, exactly where I had placed it. He did not speak for a long moment. Then, quietly, with something in his voice that I had not heard since he was very young and had just understood something he had not wanted to understand. "She told me you were losing your memory, Mom." I looked at him steadily. "I know, son," I said. "That's how she kept us apart." The words landed in the space between us and stayed there. Calvin looked at the notebook. He looked at his hands. Outside, a car went by on Rutledge Avenue, its engine loud and then gone. I watched my son sit with the weight of what he had just read and what I had just said, and I did not try to soften it or move past it too quickly, because some things need to be felt completely before they can be understood. My son folded the notebook, closed, and didn't say a word for a long time. What he did next was entirely his own decision. He called me on Monday afternoon at 2:17. I know the time because I was at my kitchen table paying bills when the phone rang, and the clock on the microwave was the first thing I looked at when I heard his voice. Not because the time mattered, just because when something is about to change, you find yourself noting the ordinary details around it, the way people do when they want to remember exactly where they were standing. Calvin had not called since Thursday. I had not pushed. I had told him what he needed to know and given him the notebook and left the rest to him, the way Thomas had always said you had to leave certain things open-handed, without condition, trusting that the person you loved would find their way to the right place if you gave them room to do it. 2 days had been enough. Diane had a standing Monday appointment she kept without exception, Calvin told me later. 12:30 to 3 o'clock, every week. He had known about it for years and had never thought much about it. It was simply a fixed point in the week, like the trash pickup or the mail. That Monday, he had come home from work at noon for lunch, which he also did sometimes. He had made a sandwich. He had stood at the kitchen counter eating it and looking at the laptop Diane kept on the desk in the corner of the living room, and he had stood there for a long time before he did anything. Then he sat down and opened it. The password was the one she had used for years, a combination of her law school graduation year and her mother's maiden name. Calvin had known it since before they were married. He had never used it without her knowing. He used it now. He was not looking for anything specific, he said. He was looking the way you look when you don't want to find what you're afraid you're going to find, but you have gotten to the point where not knowing is worse than knowing. The folder was not hidden. That was the thing that struck him first. It was right there in the documents section of her desktop, labeled with a name he recognized, the name of a law firm she had mentioned once or twice, a colleague of hers, someone she described as a contact. He almost passed over it. Then something about the label made him stop. He opened it. Inside were emails, organized by date, going back 11 months. The correspondent was a man named David Crenshaw, an attorney whose firm, Calvin would later learn, specialized in elder law and estate matters. The emails were careful in the way that professional correspondence between lawyers is careful, precise language, no unnecessary detail, everything framed in terms of hypotheticals and general inquiries. But Calvin had grown up watching Thomas read documents. He knew how to find what was underneath the careful language. The first email discussed the process for challenging the financial competency of an individual over 60, the documentation required, the timeline involved, the threshold of evidence a court would need to see. It asked, specifically, about situations where the individual appeared functional but could be argued to be making decisions that were not in their best interest. Calvin read it once. Then he sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he leaned forward and read it again. The second thread discussed a limited liability company structure, the kind where a single managing member held sole signing authority, and what legal mechanisms existed for transferring that authority under circumstances where the member was deemed unfit. It referenced a specific company name, Whitfield & Sons. Calvin's hands went still on the keyboard. He read to the end of the thread, then he went back to the beginning and read it again. The third thread was the one that made him close the laptop. It was shorter than the others, just 4 exchanges, the most recent dated 3 weeks ago. It discussed placement options for a minor in the household in the event that family dynamics shifted significantly. It used words like alternative residential arrangement and structured support environment and transition timeline. It discussed the minor's lack of biological connection to one parent as a relevant factor in determining custodial flexibility. The minor's name was not written anywhere in the email. It did not need to be. Calvin sat in the living room of the house on Beaufort Street for a long time after he closed the laptop, long enough for the light to shift, long enough for the refrigerator to cycle through twice, long enough to understand, completely and without any remaining room for doubt, what had been happening in his own house while he had been choosing to believe the version of things his wife had offered him. Then he picked up his phone. My phone rang at 2:17, and I answered before the second ring finished. Mom. His voice was different from any version of it I could remember. Not angry, not crying, just stripped of everything except what was true. Mom, I found, he stopped. A breath. I went through her laptop. I know, I said quietly. There are emails. About you. About the company. About... He stopped again. When he spoke next, his voice had dropped to something very low. About Marcus. I closed the bill I had been working on and set down my pen. How much did you read? I asked. All of it, he said. Twice. A silence opened between us. Outside my kitchen window, the October light was doing what it did in the afternoons now, going gold and long across the backyard, reaching all the way to Thomas's rose bushes along the fence. Mom, what do I do? I looked at the rose bushes for a moment, at the long gold light, at the ordinary afternoon that had just become something else entirely for my son. Come over, I said. Bring Marcus. He arrived at 3:45. He knocked, which he did not usually do. I opened the door, and there he was, coat on, keys still in his hand, Marcus standing slightly behind him with a backpack over one shoulder and those careful dark eyes moving across my face the way they always did, reading it, checking in. Calvin had not brought anything for himself. No overnight bag, no extra clothes, nothing that suggested he had planned beyond this moment. Just his son and his keys and whatever he had decided in the 40 minutes it took him to drive across the city. He came with his son and nothing else. And that told me everything I needed to know about who Calvin Whitfield really was. Calvin and Marcus slept in the guest room. I had made up the bed the night before while Calvin sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he barely touched, and Marcus sat beside him doing homework with the focused, unhurried manner of a child who has learned to find solid ground in ordinary tasks when everything else is uncertain. At some point, Marcus had looked up at me and asked if he could use the shelf in the hallway for his backpack. I told him the shelf had been waiting for something useful to hold. He nodded and put his backpack there with the same seriousness he brought to everything, and then he went back to his homework. I had stood in the hallway for a moment after that, looking at his backpack on the shelf next to Thomas's photograph, and I had let myself feel something I had not let myself feel in a long time. Ready. George arrived at 8:15 Tuesday morning. He came the way he always came, to serious meetings folder under his arm, coffee in hand from the place on Broad Street, the unhurried manner of a man who had learned long ago that appearing calm was half the work of any difficult situation. He shook Calvin's hand at the door, and I watched something pass between them, the particular recognition of two people meeting for the first time who have each heard enough about the other to already understand where they stand. Marcus was at the kitchen table eating toast. He looked up when George came in. George looked at him for a moment, then said good morning in the direct, unpatronizing way that children recognize and appreciate, and Marcus said good morning back and went back to his toast. We settled at the kitchen table, the four of us. I poured coffee for George and refilled Calvin's cup. Outside the window, the morning was bright and cold, the kind of October morning that looks like summer from the inside of a warm house and lets you know otherwise the moment you step out. George opened his folder. He laid out the legal picture methodically, the way he laid out everything. The forged signature on the power of attorney document had been reviewed by Patricia Odom, whose findings he had submitted to the appropriate authorities the previous Thursday. The documentation was sufficient. He said the handwriting analysis, the timeline, the record of access. What they had was not circumstantial. It was direct. Sufficient for what? Calvin asked. For a criminal filing, George said. Forgery of a legal document in South Carolina carries real consequences. This is not a civil matter. Calvin was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee. She didn't know I found the emails, he said. No, George said. And the emails, combined with the forgery evidence, establish intent clearly. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was a sustained plan. He paused. Which actually makes the legal position stronger, not weaker. I thought about Diane sitting across from me at that dinner table 8 months ago with the insurance paperwork and the ready explanation and the 30 minutes she had calculated she would need. Sustained was exactly the right word. At 9 o'clock, I excused myself and went to the living room to make a phone call. The contact at Hartwell Industries was a man named Warren Oglesby, the operations director, someone Thomas had worked with for years and who had continued the relationship after Thomas passed. I had met him twice. He was a practical man who communicated in short sentences and appreciated the same in return. He answered on the second ring. I told him I was calling to confirm the status of the renewal on the Whitfield & Sons contract. He confirmed it. The contract expired in 79 days now, he said, and they had not received any renewal documentation yet, which had been a point of some internal discussion. I told him the renewal would come directly from me, in writing, on my timeline. A brief pause. Then, understood, Mrs. Whitfield. We'll wait to hear from you. I thanked him and ended the call. Through the doorway, I could see George making a note on his legal pad. Calvin had his hands folded on the table, looking at them. Marcus had finished his toast and was sitting quietly with his notebook in front of him, not writing in it, just resting his hand on the cover the way you rest your hand on something you want to keep track of. I came back to the table and sat down. We spent the next hour going through the specifics, what George had filed, what was likely to happen next, what Ruth's position was relative to the contract and the company and the forged document. Calvin listened carefully and asked the right questions, and I could see in the way he listened that he was his father's son after all, underneath everything that the last few years had layered over him. At 10:20, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. Then I set it face up on the table so the others could see the name. Diane. George and Calvin both went very still. Marcus looked at the phone, then at me. I let it ring 3 times. Then I picked it up. "Diane?" I said. Her voice was careful and pleasant in the way it got when she was performing composure. She said she had been thinking that she felt badly about how things had been between us, that she thought it might be good to talk things over, clear the air. She used the phrase "clear the air" twice. She said she was sure we could come to an understanding if we just had a chance to sit down together. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "Come for dinner, tonight." A brief silence. Then, with something that almost sounded like relief, Yes, that would be good. Should I?" "Just you," I said. 7 o'clock. I ended the call and set the phone back on the table. George and Calvin exchanged a look across the kitchen, the kind of look that does not need words because the words are already understood. Marcus had not moved. He was still sitting with his hand on the notebook, watching me with those careful dark eyes of his. After a moment, he asked very quietly, "Are you scared, Grandma?" I looked at him, at this boy who had carried a secret for months in his shirt pocket, who had run after me in the dark to make sure I had what I needed, who had sat on the 3rd step of a staircase and listened and written everything down because he understood, at 12 years old, that the truth was worth keeping. "No," I said. "Your grandfather taught me that the quietest people in the room are usually the most prepared." Marcus considered that for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, and opened his notebook to a fresh page. Calvin watched his son and did not say a word. George picked up his pen. Outside, the October morning continued, bright and cold and entirely ordinary, the way mornings are before evenings that change everything. By the time Diane's headlights swept across the front window that evening, we were ready. Every single one of us. The headlights came at 7 o'clock exactly. I was standing at the living room window when they swept across the front of the house, 2 pale arcs moving through the dark, there and gone, and then the sound of a car door closing on the street outside. I stepped back from the window and looked at the room. George was in the armchair near the bookcase, folder on his knee, reading glasses in his hand. Calvin was on the couch, forearms resting on his thighs, not quite still. Marcus was in the chair by the hallway, Thomas's old reading chair, the one with the worn left armrest with his notebook closed in his lap and his hands resting on top of it. He was looking at the front door. I went to answer it. Diane had dressed carefully. She always dressed carefully. But tonight there was a particular precision to it, a dark blazer, her hair done, the understated jewelry she wore when she wanted to project competence without effort. She had a small bag over one shoulder. When I opened the door, her expression was arranged into something that was designed to look like openness. "Ruth," she said. Warm. Measured. "Thank you for having me." "Come in," I said. She stepped into the hallway and stopped. She had expected, I think, to find me alone. Or perhaps me and Calvin, in some version of a family conversation she had prepared for. What she found instead was a living room with 4 people in it, 2 of whom she had not accounted for, and a particular quality of stillness that told her, before anyone had said a word, that this evening was not going to go the way she had planned. Her eyes moved from George to Calvin to Marcus and back to me. Something shifted behind them, not panic, not yet, but the first edge of recalculation. I didn't realize we were she started. "Sit down, Diane," Calvin said. His voice was quiet, not angry, just done with the performance of things. She sat. For a moment no one spoke. The living room held its silence the way old houses hold things steadily, without effort, as if it had been built for exactly this purpose. Then Calvin reached into the folder on the coffee table and took out the printed emails. He did not hand them to her. He held them and began to read aloud. He started with the first thread, the one about elderly competency filings, the questions about documentation and timelines and thresholds of evidence. He read in a level voice, without commentary, the way you read something when you want the words themselves to do the work. Diane sat very still across from him. Her hands were in her lap. Her expression had moved from arranged openness to something more careful, more controlled. Calvin turned to the second thread. He read the questions about LLC structures and signing authority and what legal mechanisms existed for transferring control when a managing member was deemed unfit. He read the name Whitfield and Sons where it appeared. He read the phrase sole signing authority and the phrase transfer of control and the phrase declared unfit. Diane's jaw tightened. She looked at the table between them. Calvin turned to the third thread. He read about alternative residential arrangements, structured support environments, transition timelines, the relevance of biological connection in determining custodial flexibility. He read all of it to the end. Then he set the pages down on the coffee table, facing her, and waited. Diane looked at the pages. She looked at Calvin. She drew a breath. That's just preliminary research, she said. You look into options before you need them. That's what responsible planning looks like. Forging my mother's signature, Calvin said, is not responsible planning. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Diane's composure cracked not all at once, but the way ice cracks, from a single point outward, the structure suddenly visible in a way it had not been before. I don't know what you think you... George spoke for the first time. Mrs. Whitfield. His voice was courteous and exact, the voice he used when courtesy was not warmth but precision. A document bearing what appears to be Ruth's signature was submitted to my office 8 months ago. A forensic document examiner has confirmed the signature is not authentic. The findings have been filed with the appropriate authorities. This is a matter of record. Diane looked at George. Something moved through her expression that she did not quite manage to control, a flash of something that was not anger and not fear, but the particular recognition of a person who has just understood that the ground they were standing on was never as solid as they believed. I want to be clear about one other thing, George continued. The Whitfield & Sons contract with Hartwell Industries comes up for renewal in 79 days. That renewal requires Ruth's direct authorization as managing member. It will be executed on Ruth's terms, on Ruth's timeline, and under no circumstances that were arranged or anticipated by anyone else. Diane was quiet. The room was quiet. Then Marcus stood up. He did it without announcement, the way he did most things, quietly, deliberately, without asking permission or drawing attention to himself until the moment the action itself made attention unavoidable. He walked to the coffee table and set his notebook down beside the printed emails. He did not open it. He simply placed it there and stepped back and returned to Thomas's chair and sat down again. Diane looked at the notebook. She looked at Marcus. For the first time that evening, something crossed her face that was not calculation or composure or controlled response. It was the expression of a person who has just understood that they were seen not partially, not in the version they had been careful to present, but completely, from the beginning, by someone they had not thought to account for. A 12-year-old boy in a worn armchair with his hands folded in his lap. Calvin stood up. He was not a tall man, but he stood in a way that used all of whatever height he had, and he looked at Diane with the expression of someone who has finished grieving something and is now simply stating what is true. I want you to understand something, he said. This is my mother, and this is my son. They will always have a place at my table. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Diane opened her mouth. Then she closed it. She looked at the emails on the table. She looked at Marcus's notebook beside them. She looked at George, who was watching her with the patient, unreadable expression of a man who had spent decades in rooms like this one and knew exactly how they ended. She looked at me. I looked back at her and did not say a word, because there was nothing left for me to say. Everything that needed to be said was already in that room, in the pages on the table, in the notebook beside them, in the 4 people who had gathered in this house, because they had each, in their own way and in their own time, chosen truth over convenience. Diane had nothing to say, just the truth, sitting in the room where it had always belonged. The 2 weeks after that Tuesday evening were the quietest 2 weeks I had known in a long time. Not empty, there was plenty happening, just not the kind of happening that made noise. George was in motion in the way George was always in motion when something needed to be done correctly, methodically, without announcement, making calls and filing documents and setting things in order with the unhurried precision of a man who understood that the most important work rarely looked dramatic from the outside. Calvin was staying in the guest room for now. He had gone back to the house on Beaufort Street once to collect things for himself and Marcus, and he had not said much about how that had gone, and I had not pushed him to. Marcus had started taking the bus to school from my street, which he seemed to regard as a reasonable arrangement, and every afternoon he came home and put his backpack on the hallway shelf and did his homework at my kitchen table as though this had always been the plan. I let it be the plan. On a Wednesday morning in early November, I drove to Columbia. Hartwell Industries occupied a low, wide building on the east side of the city, the kind of corporate campus that had been built to look permanent, all brick and glass and carefully maintained landscaping, the sort of place that announces itself without shouting. I had driven past buildings like it 100 times without giving them much thought. Today, I pulled into the visitor parking lot, gathered my folder from the passenger seat, and went inside. Warren Oglesby met me in the lobby himself. He was a heavy-set man in his early 60s, the kind of person who moved through a room with the particular efficiency of someone who had been solving logistical problems for decades and had gotten very good at it. Thomas had always said Warren was the most straightforward person he had ever done business with, which was the highest compliment Thomas gave. He shook my hand firmly and led me back through a hallway to a conference room that looked out over a loading dock, where 2 trucks were being staged for afternoon runs. I recognized the trucks. Whitfield and Sons. Thomas's handwriting, in the old logo, still on the door panels. We sat down. Warren had a copy of the existing contract already printed and tabbed. He had a legal pad. He looked like a man ready to work, which was what I had come for. I had spent the better part of the previous week preparing the renewal terms with George. Not complicated terms. Thomas had never believed in unnecessary complexity, but specific ones. The contract would renew for 3 years rather than 1, locking in the rate at a modest increase that accounted for operational costs. The managing member authorization clause would be updated and made explicit, clearly establishing Ruth Ann Whitfield as the sole individual with authority to modify, transfer, or terminate the agreement. A new provision would require Hartwell to notify Whitfield and Sons directly of any third-party inquiries regarding the contract's status or the company's ownership structure. That last provision had been my idea. Warren read through the revised terms without rushing. He asked 2 questions, both practical, both answered quickly. Then he set down his pen. "These are reasonable terms," he said. "I thought so," I said. He nodded once and reached for his own pen to initial the revisions. We worked through the signature pages methodically. My name, written in my own hand, on every line that required it. Each signature the same pressure, the same rhythm, the same terminal stroke on the last letter of my last name. The one that, as Patricia Odom had noted, lifted at a particular angle that no copy had quite managed to reproduce. When we finished, Warren gathered the signed copies and set one in front of me and kept one for his files. He sat back in his chair and looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man reassessing something. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I want to be straightforward with you. We were contacted several months ago by an attorney representing a party who claimed to have authority to negotiate on your behalf regarding this contract. We declined to engage without direct confirmation from you. But I'll be honest, the inquiry was persistent." "I know," I said. "We should have called you directly sooner." "Yes," I said. "You should have." He accepted that without argument, which I respected. Then he said, "We had no idea who we were really dealing with." I looked at the signed contract on the table between us, at my name, written clearly and correctly and entirely by my own hand, on every line that mattered. "Most people don't," I said. George called me on the drive home. He had been in contact with Diane's firm that morning, he said, delivering the formal documentation of the forgery findings. The firm had responded within the hour. Diane had been removed from the Hartwell litigation effective immediately, pending an internal review of her conduct. The opposing counsel in the case had already been notified of the development, which George described as having received that information with considerable interest. He had also, that morning, filed the criminal complaint with the appropriate authorities. Forgery of a legal document. The documentation was complete. The process would now move at the pace the process moved, which was not fast, but which was certain. I thanked him and told him to send me whatever I needed to review. Then I drove the rest of the way home with the windows down, even though November had made the air cold enough to notice. I wanted to feel it anyway, the particular cold of a morning that has done what it came to do. I thought about Thomas, about the contract on that table with my name on every line, about the structure he had built, quietly and carefully, so that the only way through it was through me. About the fact that he had done all of that and then left me a letter explaining it, trusting that I would open it when the time came and know what to do. He had been right. I had known. Diane had spent 8 months trying to take my signature. In the end, that signature was the thing that ended everything she had built. He came on a Saturday morning without calling first. I heard the knock at 9:47, I know, because I had just looked at the clock on the stove, deciding whether it was too early for a second pot of coffee and concluding it was not. Marcus was still asleep down the hall. The house was in that particular Saturday quiet that feels inhabited rather than empty. I opened the door. Calvin was standing on the porch in his old dark green jacket, the one with the worn collar I had offered to repair twice, hands in his pockets. The look of a man who had been awake too long and had driven here before he could change his mind. "Hey, Mom," he said. "Come in," I said. "I just made coffee." We sat at the kitchen table, which was where we had always sat for the conversations that mattered. I poured 2 cups, set one in front of him, kept one for myself. Calvin wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at it. Then he looked at me. "I knew something," he said. "4 months ago. Not everything, not the signature, not Hartwell, but I knew she was looking into your finances. She told me she was worried about you." He paused. I told myself she meant well. I let him continue. She was my wife. I trusted her, and I chose to believe the version she gave me, even when parts of it didn't sit right. Even when Marcus looked at me sometimes like he was deciding whether to say something and then deciding not to, he set the mug down. I should have asked more questions. I didn't. Outside, a sparrow landed on the bird feeder Thomas had hung from the oak tree the year Calvin turned 10. It sat there a moment, then flew off. "I'm sorry, Mom," Calvin said. "For the dinner, for the phone call, for all of it." I looked at my son. At the lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples, the expression he had worn since childhood when he was genuinely ashamed, not performing it, just carrying it. "I know you are," I said. "That's not enough." "No," I agreed, "but it's the right place to start." He nodded. We sat in the silence of 2 people who have said the hard thing and are letting it settle. Then he said, "I filed the paperwork on Thursday. The divorce." "Yes." He looked at the table. "It's going to take time. She has a lawyer, things to work through." A pause. "Marcus doesn't know yet. I'm going to tell him this weekend." I thought about Marcus asleep down the hall, backpack on the hallway shelf, notebook probably on the nightstand. "He's going to be all right," I said. "He's stronger than you know." Calvin looked up. "He's stronger than I deserve right now." "Maybe," I said. "But that's not how love works. It doesn't wait until you've earned it." He was quiet. Then he said the thing he had driven here to say. "I want to do this right. Whatever comes next. I want to be the kind of father Marcus needs and the kind of son he stopped." Exhaled. "I don't know if I can undo what happened, but I want to build something worth having. I just don't know if there's a way back. For us." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I stood up, picked up the coffee pot, and walked to his side of the table. I refilled his cup slowly, the way you do something when you want the action to carry what the words cannot manage on their own. Then I set the pot down and looked at him. "Rebuilding takes longer than breaking," I said. "Are you ready for that?" Calvin looked at the freshly filled cup. Then he looked at me. "Yes," he said. I sat back down. Outside, the sparrow had returned to the feeder and brought another one with it. The November light came through the window at its low, long angle, warm-looking even when the air outside said otherwise. We drank our coffee. We didn't solve anything in that hour. We didn't map out what came next or find the right answers to all the questions still waiting. We simply sat at the kitchen table in the Saturday morning quiet and let the conversation be what it was: imperfect, incomplete, and entirely necessary. When Calvin finally stood to leave, he paused in the doorway. "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up on me." I looked at my son, this man who had made a serious mistake and driven here before he could change his mind to say so, and I thought about Thomas, about all the things Thomas had believed about love being something you kept choosing rather than something you earned. I thought about Marcus asleep down the hall. I thought about how long it had taken to get to this kitchen on this morning. "You're my son," I said. "That was never the question." He nodded once. Then he went down the hall to check on Marcus, and I sat at the kitchen table and finished my coffee and listened to the quiet of a house that was, slowly and imperfectly, beginning to become something again. I didn't tell him it would be easy. I told him it would be worth it, and for the first time in years, I believed he understood the difference. 6 months is both a long time and not long at all. It is long enough for a criminal case to move from filing to arraignment, for a law firm's internal review to conclude, for a marriage to be legally dissolved in the state of South Carolina. It is long enough for a man to find a small apartment 12 minutes from his mother's house and paint the walls and hang a hook by the door for his son's backpack. It is long enough for a 12-year-old boy to learn that change. Even the kind that arrives without warning and costs more than anyone planned does not have to mean the end of things. It is not long enough to forget, but it can be long enough to begin. I reopened the shop on the first Saturday of April. Not Whitfield Alterations, that name belonged to a different chapter, one I had closed along with everything else when Thomas got sick. This one I called simply the Whitfield Shop, which seemed right. Honest about what it was and where it came from without trying to be more than that. It was a small space on King Street, 2 storefronts down from where the original shop had been. Narrow, good light, a window facing the street that let in the morning sun at an angle that made the fabric bolts glow if you arranged them right. I had spent 3 weeks setting it up: the machines, the cutting table, the little counter near the door where I kept the order book, and a jar of peppermints that had been a fixture of every version of this business I had ever run. The morning I opened, Sandra arrived before I did. She was standing on the sidewalk outside with 2 coffees and a look on her face that said she had been there for a while and was not going to pretend otherwise. "You're late," she said. "I'm 3 minutes early," I said. "I've been here for 20, she said. "So you're late." I unlocked the door and she followed me in and set the coffees on the counter and looked around at what I had done with the space, with the expression she used when she approved of something but was not going to make a production of it. Thomas's photograph was on the wall behind the cutting table. I had taken it down from the hallway shelf at home 2 weeks earlier and brought it here, to this room, where the work was. It seemed right. Thomas had always belonged in the places where things were being made, not displayed on a shelf, not preserved in a frame in a quiet hallway, but present in the room where the doing happened. He was in his work shirt in the photograph, standing in front of the first Whitfield & Sons truck, one hand resting on the door panel, looking not at the camera but at something slightly to the left of it. The way he always looked at things, not at the surface, but just past it, like he was interested in what was on the other side. I had hung it at eye level, slightly to the right of the window, where the morning light fell on it without washing it out. It looked like it had always been there. Marcus arrived at 9 o'clock, the way he arrived at 9 o'clock every Saturday, backpack over one shoulder, the small notebook in his shirt pocket. He was 13 now, an inch taller than he had been in October, and he moved through the world with the same careful attention he had always had, except that there was something easier about it now, less watchful, less braced, more like curiosity and less like vigilance. He said good morning to Sandra, who told him the coffee was for adults and then immediately handed him a hot chocolate she had also brought, which he accepted without comment because by now they both understood how that exchange was going to go. He hung his backpack on the hook by the door and settled at the stool I had placed at the end of the cutting table. This was where he sat on Saturday mornings. He had opinions, already, about thread tension and the proper way to finish a seam, and he expressed them with the directness of someone who had not yet learned to doubt what he knew. Thomas would have found him remarkable. I did not need to guess about that. The morning moved the way Saturday mornings move, in a place that is doing what it is supposed to do steadily, without drama, punctuated by the small satisfactions of work being done correctly. Sandra and I drank our coffee. Marcus worked on a straight seam he had been practicing for 2 weeks. A customer came in at 10 with a dress that needed the zipper replaced, and I took her measurements and wrote the order in the book, and she left and the bell above the door settled back into silence. At some point Marcus looked up from his work. "Grandma," he said. He was quiet for a moment in the way he got quiet when he was deciding how to say something. "Did you always know it would work out?" I set down the spool I had been threading and looked at him. He was watching me with those dark eyes, the ones that had always reminded me of Thomas, not because of the color but because of what was in them. The patience, the willingness to wait for an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. I thought about a Friday evening in October and a dinner table and words that had been meant to diminish. I thought about a dark sidewalk and small hands pressing a notebook into my coat pocket. I thought about a safe in a closet, unopened for 7 years. About a letter on cream legal paper written by a man who was running out of time and chose to spend what he had left building something that would last. "No," I said. "But your grandfather did." Marcus considered that. Then he nodded, the way he nodded when something settled into place for him and went back to his seam. Sandra looked at me over the rim of her coffee cup and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Later, when the morning had stretched toward noon and the light through the window had shifted from gold to something softer, I stood at the cutting table and looked out at King Street. A woman pushed a stroller past. 2 men stood talking outside the hardware store across the way. Ordinary Saturday, ordinary city, ordinary life continuing in its ordinary directions. Thomas's words came back to me the way they had been coming back to me for months, arriving not as memory but as something closer to presence. Everything I built has your name on it. Use it when the time comes. He had been right. It did. If this story found you at a moment when you needed it, when you were carrying something heavy, or wondering whether the quiet way of doing things was still worth it, or simply trying to remember that patience is not the same as surrender, then I hope it gave you something to hold on to. Stories like this one survive because people pass them on. If it meant something to you, share it with someone you think might need it too. And if you have your own story about holding the line, about choosing dignity when something easier was available, about the people who showed up in the dark with what you needed, I would love to hear it in the comments. Thank you for staying until the end.